Okay, brilliant. I think we're going to make a start now. Our numbers are starting to look quite healthy. So welcome again to this Collective Voice webinar. Today we're going to focus on integrated care systems and what their kind of ongoing iterative creation means for drug and alcohol treatment and recovery services, the people that work for them, and most importantly, the people who receive support from them. I'm really pleased today to be joined by three fantastic speakers. We've got Anna Charles, who is a senior advisor at the King's Fund. We've got Kevin Crowley, who is a health policy consultant and was previously executive director at Change Grow Live, a national treatment provider. And we've got Zoe Rice, who is a transformation manager for population health management at NHS Bristol, North Somerset and South Gloucestershire, I think, integrated care system, and also has a background in the treatment and recovery side of things. So we're covering lots of bases between our brilliant panel. My name's Oliver Standing and I'm director of Collective Voice, and Collective Voice is the national charity working on the health and flourishing qualities of England's drug and alcohol treatment and recovery systems, I suppose. I've worked in this field for over 10 years, I think coming on for 12 years, starting my career at ADFAM, the national charity for families affected by drug and alcohol use. And this issue of integration, connection, coordination really has struck me ever since those early days of working at ADFAM. Bits of the system are fantastic, the people working in the system are fantastic, but when we all access health and care services as citizens or as people who need support from public services, it's sometimes the bit between the services that let us down. It's sometimes the communication or the coordination or the sense of really just talking to different systems with different ways of doing things, different ways of handling data, different sets of languages, different priorities, and different cultures sometimes. And that as a citizen, as a consumer of services, can make things feel quite bumpy, as well as adversely impacting on health and care itself. So the idea of integration on an issue like drug and alcohol use, which has multiple diverse drivers, we know is underpinned by, the socio-economic realities and inequalities in this country, and we know is manifest in lots of different ways. Integration and the bringing together of services in a better, more humane, more citizen-centered, I suppose, way can only be a good thing. The only thing I'd say as a counterpoint, we've got a huge level of change in our world at the moment, of course. We've recently seen the publication almost exactly a year ago of From Harm to Hope, the national 10-year cross-government drug strategy, and a major settlement of 3 years to bring that to life. So we're in the first year of that funding and a major investment for treatment and recovery services. We've got major political and economic storm clouds on the horizon following our period of Trustonomics earlier this year. We've had the autumn statement. There are major questions about investment in public services and austerity 2.0. And there's ongoing, a national kind of debate and sort of dialogue as ever about the NHS, isn't there? Some of which is helpful and some of which isn't. So we've got a real sense of change, a sense of flux, a sense of these reforms coming on and then being immensely important. But for a lot of us, we're still looking at them a little bit and scratching our heads and saying, well, what does this really mean for me? What does this really mean for the people that I serve? If you are scratching your head and thinking that, don't be alarmed. Those are entirely legitimate questions. I'm still asking those questions after getting into this stuff and researching it for a number of months and reading lots of blogs and articles and talking to lots of impressive people like those on the panel. I think we should all be scratching our heads. I think scratching our heads is a good thing, as is talking to people, as is listening to people, as is just trying to get stuck into this and make some sense of it. So that's what we're here to do today. We don't claim to have a perfect set of answers for you. We don't claim to all be kind of experts who can give you definitive answers on everything, but we do promise to hold as productive and fruitful and interesting a conversation as possible. Therefore, the emphasis is on conversation and Q&A rather than having really long presentations. So great, that's enough for me. I'm going to turn to our panelists. Now, each panelist will have 10 minutes. We're keeping them quite short. 10 minutes to make their presentation. That gives us 30 minutes. And then the remainder of the session, as I say, is to get those questions coming in from you all as attendees. So please keep the questions flowing. There is a dedicated Q&A function. So if you could use the Q&A function rather than using the chat function, it would make our lives a bit easier. If you want to use the chat function to chat and say hi and who you are, by all means, please go for it. We will share these presentations after the session, and we will be putting them onto our blog where we're going to collate everything. So that's fantastic. I'm going to turn to our panelists and ask first Anna to speak. And Anna, as I say, is from the King's Fund. So in terms of thinking about the three presentations on their order, we're going to start big picture with Anna. We're going to go down into the middle level from Kevin, who's going to look kind of both up and down, and then probably side to side and possibly diagonally. And then we're going to go down to Zoe, who's got a local level, really exciting, good practice example of how all this stuff can be brought round and made to work. Great. So Anna, if I could hand over to you for your 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oliver. And I will just start by sharing my screen. Okay, you can see? Thumbs up. We can. Very good. So as Oliver says, I'm hoping that my bit will provide some context, really, the big picture that will set the scene for the rest of the discussion and the other presentations that you'll hear. So I'm Anna, I work at the King's Fund, and we have worked alongside systems as they've developed into ICSs over a number of years. So we look both at the national picture, but we also work closely with local systems alongside them as they develop. So I'll try and bring both of those insights into what I say. I'm going to say a little bit about what ICSs are and what they're for, just really laying out some of the basics, because I think it's always helpful to start from there. I'll say a bit about what they look like in practice so far, recognising this is all a moving picture. And I'll give some thoughts then about sort of risks and opportunities to look out for going forward, and particularly as you may be working with or alongside ICSs. So let's start with what ICSs are. This is the definition that we've used at the fund. So they are partnerships that bring together NHS organisations, local authorities and others to take collective responsibility for planning services, improving health and reducing inequalities across geographical areas. So this diagram represents the range of organisations, broadly speaking, that you might find in a typical local health and care economy. Of course, there will be many others, but these are some of the sort of key partners that we would expect to see involved in an ICS. And the idea is that by having the integrated care system there as that partnership, it brings and binds those organisations together so that they can work in partnership to do a number of things, so that they can collectively understand needs and set priorities for their population, rather than all being off in their silos, understanding their one bit of the system. That where possible and where appropriate, they can then pool resources and align their strategies behind those priorities, so everyone's pulling in the same direction. And they can support changes to services and to infrastructure to support that, and also stand back and look at the overall performance of that system and do what is needed to improve that. There are 42 integrated care systems across England. Here they are. This map is from NHS England. They, as you can see, just looking at that at a glance, they vary widely in size. So spanning anything from a population of 500,000 to 3 million. And really importantly, in July of this year, they transitioned from informal partnerships, which is what they've been for a number of years, where they sat across existing structures, but didn't really change the sort of fundamentals of who was responsible for what, to actually become legal entities with statutory powers and responsibilities. And as part of that, they took on the commissioning functions that were previously held by clinical commissioning groups, and some of the commissioning functions of NHS England, actually. So they now control a large proportion of the NHS budget, and they have direct responsibility and accountability for performance. So stepping back though, what is actually the point of ICSs? And I think really you can just put that into two broad buckets. So first, they are the latest in a long line of initiatives, which I'm sure many people on the webinar will be very familiar with, designed to better integrate care. And that is both within the NHS, primary and secondary care, mental and physical health care, but also between NHS and social care or other surrounding services. So some of the problems that Oliver was talking about at the beginning there. And then they also have this wider remit around improving population health and tackling inequalities, really recognising there the key influence of the wider determinants of health, and actually that the NHS cannot even begin to tackle some of those things on its own. It has to be part of these wider partnerships if it's really going to do anything to improve that. And I think it's also helpful to think of the sort of wider philosophical shift that this is all a part of, actually, because there is a broad strategic shift that has been going on for a number of years in terms of how the health and care system should be organised, is organised. And that shift involves moving from a focus on individual organisations, whether it be on their individual performance, their individual outcomes, their individual financial bottom line as a single organisation, towards thinking about them as players within a system. So actually, what are they doing in terms of how they are contributing to the overall outcomes for their population, for their place? And there's also then this shift from a focus on competition and market mechanisms as being the driving forces for improvement in health and care, which has been a focus for several decades, towards instead this focus on integration and partnership. And as part of that, a real attempt to shift that very transactional relationship there's been between commissioners and providers based on contracts and negotiation towards one where they're working hand in hand to plan and improve care. There are various sort of aims and objectives set out for ICSs. NHS England has set out 4 key aims for them, which match up broadly to those things that I've already described. But one thing that is worth saying, and I will come back to, is what they were set up for and what they're technically there to do does not always match up to the experience of those working in ICSs about what they're really being asked to focus on in the day-to-day, particularly given some of the operational pressures there are, particularly in the health service at the moment, and I can come back to that. So what then do they look like? Well, first of all, I think now that they're statutory, it is worth noting some of the technical things. So there are some common features to the basic governance model across all ICSs. So they comprise 2 key components. They have an integrated care board, which is a statutory body within the ICS that is responsible for planning and funding most NHS services in the area. So that's where a lot of the CCG functions, a lot of where the budgets went to. And then alongside, there is an integrated care partnership, and that operates as a statutory committee that brings together a very broad range of system partners across local government, across the voluntary and community sector, across the NHS. And that partnership is tasked with producing an integrated care strategy for the overall system, which should be built up from the local health and wellbeing board strategies. And then the integrated care board must have regard to that strategy developed by the partnership as it makes its plans and its priorities. It's very early days for that dual structure and how those 2 bodies will sit alongside each other, work in practice. So that's one to look out for. But if that's the theory of what they look like in governance terms, as you'd imagine, once you get under the skin of that locally, there's a lot more nuance in terms of what they actually look like and how they work. And probably the key thing that we see there as we're going around working with different systems around the country is just massive variation, whether that's in terms of their size, their complexity, the local challenges they're grappling with, who they're involving, how they're involving them, their ways of working, their ways of making decisions, and just actually their maturity in terms of being able to work as a system, as a partnership, making that shift from a sort of transactional way of working to a much more collaborative one. And that variation has emerged because of the way ICSs were developed, which has actually been quite bottom-up, quite evolutionary. It's been quite different to NHS reforms of the past. That has a lot of pluses for a lot of people, but it does mean that when you're standing back and looking at it, it looks pretty complex and it looks pretty varied, and that's because it is. And none of this is static, which adds to the complexity. So they may have become statutory bodies in July, but their development did not finish there. This is still evolving. This is a work in progress. And then the final thing on this slide that I wanted to say, which is really important, I think, is that there is sort of a key part of the development of ICSs is a recognition that actually the ICS isn't going to do everything. a lot of the work of integration needs to happen much more locally than over a population scale of 1 to 3 million. So what we're seeing emerge is this sort of three-tiered model, although it looks different in different parts of the country, of local partnerships existing within the ICS. So you have the integrated care system across the population of several million that can set the overall strategy, it can manage the resources, it can look at some of the cross-cutting infrastructure. But actually then within that you have forming smaller place-based partnerships, often around the sort of population covered by an upper tier local authority. And actually that's where a lot of the work around driving service change, around joint working with local government, around working differently with communities, that's where the energy is around some of that work. And then even more locally, you have multidisciplinary teams forming around local neighbourhoods. So this idea of kind of systems within systems. And this is what that looks like in one particular system. So the South Yorkshire ICS has within it 4 places, many of which are kind of places that people probably identify with much more strongly than South Yorkshire as a whole. And then within that 30 local neighbourhoods. And then alongside those geographical groupings, there's also a plan for provider collaboratives to play an increasing role as well. I'm not going to say more at this point around place-based partnerships, around provider collaboratives, but I would point you to the King's Fund website, where we've got lots of resources, both on all of those different structures, but also on ICSs themselves and how they're working. So those links should work when the slides are circulated. But I did just want to end, before I pass on to Kevin, by just sharing some thoughts about the kind of risks and opportunities as we see them at the moment in the King's Fund. So we've got a report coming out on Thursday this week, and the title of that report is about ICSs. The title of that report is Born into a Storm, and we really feel that's in the case. You know, if you were going to set about having a new body in the system, would you really want to start that out at this point in time? The level of performance challenges, the workforce shortages, the condition of estates, not to mention the sort of wider economic and political instability, it could not really be a more challenging time for ICSs to take on the roles that they're taking on. And what all of that drives is a bit of a risk that there is a kind of short-term focus on immediate operational priorities at the expense of some of the longer-term objectives of ICSs, and actually just that the expectations and asks on them are unrealistic. And for example, we already see some of them, many of them falling behind on their financial targets. So all of that is a concern. And there are, of course, still major barriers to integration. So ICSs have taken us kind of so far on the path to integration, but there are still big structural changes, for example, in NHS and local government funding that still stand in the way of bringing things closer together. But on a more optimistic note, in spite of all of that, when we're out working with ICS leads, we see a really strong support for and commitment to the reforms. That's not the same as what I probably would have said if I was giving this presentation about the 2012 reforms, perhaps, and the objectives behind them, particularly around tackling inequalities, around improving population health. And in spite of what might be coming down on ICSs in terms of what's happening to your elective backlog, what's happening to your ambulances, actually those goals do remain front and centre locally. So we really expect that to be where some of the action is. And then just some reflections on what would the key opportunities be if we can make all of this work. Well, it is closer connections between the NHS and local government, and we can see in many systems across the country, local government playing a really strong role within ICSs and being much more closely involved than they were, say, in the early days of sustainability and transformation partnerships, which came before. And likewise, in some systems, the voluntary and community sector being much more involved as equal partners rather than a sort of secondary partner to the NHS. They could drive a renewed strategic focus on improving population health and tackling inequalities. And some systems are really trying to think differently about how they work with communities and citizens. And there are good examples out there, albeit not everywhere. But I think I will pause there, Oliver, and hand over, and we can pick up any questions and follow-ons as we go forward.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Anna. Yeah, it's so useful to have that overview, kind of looking from the top downwards at the structures, the history, the context, the policy, I think that's set the scene brilliantly for Kevin and Zoe. So attendees, do put your questions into the Q&A. I'm going to keep reminding you, things are starting to flow. So yeah, do put stuff in there, and then we'll come to those after Kevin and Zoe have spoken. So Kevin, I'm going to turn to you next. Go for it.
Sure, yeah. Well, I don't like timing to start until after I've said one thing, which is, and I've been kind of impersonating you for the past 18 months because on the subject of ICSs and their evolution and their birth, if you like, I have been evangelizing partly on behalf of the sector, but mostly on behalf of our service users, and using some of your words, I think it's fair to say. And the things I would like to draw attention to are collaboration, the variation, relationships first, and the complexity of the current situation. So I'm so glad that the impersonation appears to have gone down okay. Can I be heard okay? Can everyone hear me? Great. What I'm going to do next, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to attempt to do 18 slides in 10 minutes, which for those who've heard me speak before, no, this is entirely possible. So now, but before all that, I'm going to try to share my screen, which may be impossible. Let's see. Okay, can people see that?
Yeah.
And are we at the start? No, we're at the end. I'm just giving the game away. Okay, 18 slides in 10 minutes. Do you recognize some of those slides? Anna, here we go. Can people see this?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, I'll start with me. I'm quite old. I've been around for quite a while. I've been around for so long that I remember SHAs, PCTs, and the evolution of health over the years. And I guess one of the benefits of getting older is that you get to see patterns, and you get to see that we may have been here before, in a sense. Probably important that I am rooted in drug and alcohol treatment and care. I drifted into it in 1997 via homelessness. I was in it for 20 years in drug and alcohol treatment and care. By in it, I mean I was a frontline practitioner. I was in management. I was in policy with the Home Office, delivered training, and 15 years as an executive. That is not a screenplay that's going to be turned into a movie anytime soon. And as with many in the sector, I'm trying to leave. I'm trying to move into other areas, but I get drawn back in because actually it's really important to me, and it's really important that the people we work with, our service users, and the communities under pressure are properly represented, I think, as citizens, and are honoured as true members of society. So why we're here today, hopefully we're making space to look at what we can do, what we should be doing right now, and what we may be doing in the future. And I think it's a bit of readiness, and you talked about maturity, Anna. So our maturity as a sector and our ability to integrate with wider health and social care systems. The problems. Let's start with the problem as I see it. From far enough away, looking at one end of the telescope, our service users' lives in general, the quality of life, the healthcare outcomes are pretty poor and getting worse. It's fair to say, as a treatment and care population, we've got an early onset of illnesses which usually come later in life, and an early death, which is huge. There's a lack of early access to mainstream health, which is killing people, and there's some really good work done on this. I think Dan Lewer in particular looking at some of the reasons why death comes early to a treatment and care population has to do with access to health and social care services, not just about the concomitant issues of drug and alcohol use, other problems, service disintegration, and really we don't have enough resource even within the drug and alcohol treatment system to solve our own problems. And the other problems I see it, alcohol. Right, I'm going to crack on with this. Underneath all of that, and I'm a huge fan of systems thinking, and a huge fan of kind of trying to understand where problems come from. I think we have a big issue with kind of the mental models, our mental models as commissioners, services, and service users. The root causes of some of the drug and alcohol, the symptoms, if you like, the fruit body on the issue. Underneath it, we got deprivation, we got adverse childhood experiences, trauma, and stigma that permeates, I think, through the drug and alcohol treatment sector. We have isolated, anatomized commissioning. We've had 15 years of competition cuts, and as I described, quite silo-based contracting of drug and alcohol treatment services, and the concomitant disintegration of services. And there's a wider question of, have we been parked by the rest of mainstream health and social care commissioning? We often talk about service users being part, but I wonder if we as a sector have been. Good that this aligns with what Anna said, because there's some helpful points in what we just looked at in the integration of services, in taking a population level view of healthcare and looking wider into the determinants, the things that led up to our service users being where they are now, the things that led up to our communities being under pressure, and the wider issues around healthcare, and collaboration, not competition, as a strategy, to drive strategies. These are some of the drivers underneath the ICS, which I think are helpful to run alongside what we're about to talk about today. I'm not going to read, well, this is something I've been taking on tour, Anna, which is your slide, so I won't repeat it. Thank you for clarifying what ICSs are and what they're not. Thank you for clarifying that there are 42 of them and that they're all incredibly different, and that they represent, I think in my view, they represent an insurrection against the 2012 reforms, which has somehow come to life. But I'll move on. And we don't need this one either, because you've done this as well. For the drug and alcohol treatment sector, for 18 months, people have been saying, so what? How does this affect us? We've got drug and alcohol commissioning. We're commissioned by public health, by a local authority, and that's good, isn't it? And everything's going to be okay in the future and going forward. I think not so much. 70% of healthcare commissioning has already changed hands. Mental health and adjacent sectors have already moved in terms of their commissioning, therefore the reconfiguration and the building of services have changed. Prison health is moving when, we'll see, it could happen soon, it could happen in the next couple of years. The provider collaboratives that Anna spoke about are up and running and are developing. They're already working, they're already working within a couple, and they are going pretty well, some of them. And the provider selection regime, which is the big sort of Damocles hanging over the sector, where potentially all of our contracts come within scope for a new commissioning arrangements. That will come in. The question is when, I'm not entirely sure. And NHS Foundation Trusts are already moving as de facto commissioners of services. But more importantly, there's integration opportunities. I love this slide. I always present this slide. What we're looking at here, and this is the Cynefin framework, a way of understanding the difference between simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic. And in my view, and based on what Anna just described, we're somewhere between complex and chaotic really at the moment. There are 149 commissioning areas from drug and alcohol perspective. There's 42 ICBs, and within those, roughly 102 place-based commissioning areas, and everything is moving at pace. And Anna described almost this four-dimensional kind of theory of change is happening right now. We are somewhere between complex and chaotic. I'm going to benevolently describe it as complex. So what should we do? What is the correct response to a complex situation? And the first thing, and I'm taking with your Twitter bio, Ollie, where you say you were Oliver, sorry, where you say you're walking around the system and tapping your compass to see which direction you should go. Yeah, I think that's what we all need to do. We need to geolocate and figure out where we are in the new systems. What do we want to do in the new systems, and what can we bring as a sector that others are unable to do? I think so. So practically speaking, and I often say create the conditions. We want to create conditions for integration on our terms, if you like. We want to make our services the front door to health and social care. People walk into our services, they get everything they would normally get in health and social care, all the ancillary provision. They walk in, they get the prescribing, yes, they get the COPD pathways, they get secondary and tertiary care, and they get it as a right. We want to make our local management the systems analyzers. We want, as a sector, to take a wider view on the determinants of health and the health of our service users. And we want to make the business case practically, aggregately, and genuinely, to the rest of social care for our service users. As Anna said, the new world is relational, not transactional, so we need to focus on relationships. We got some barriers, though, and I wonder how many of these are real or perceptual. The mental models of healthcare are strong, and by that I mean people within health, and I've been working within mainstream healthcare for about 18 months now, and it is very rare that anybody mentions public health commissioning. It is vanishingly rare that anyone mentions the way in which drug and alcohol treatment services are commissioned. And I don't think I've ever heard anyone describe, particularly the VCS sector in our sector, as being a mainstream healthcare provider. It's just, we are so far removed from, I guess, healthcare commissioning as a concept from that perspective. And we're different to other sectors, and we can look a bit odd because of how we're commissioned. We are healthcare. Am I running out of time, Oliver? You've got to, no, I think I've got one and a half minutes.
1 minute.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so we can look a bit odd. Our governance is really good, but sometimes looks a bit odd. Our information governance is a bit strange. We still rely on consent as in a way that the rest of healthcare doesn't. And we've got identity and brand issues, I think, and there can be tensions between even within us, between health and social care, and between us as social action vehicles and NHS delivery vehicles. I'm not going to go into all the strengths of the sector. What I would say is, and this is the positive part, we're kind of amazing in our sector from a healthcare perspective. Our efficiency is extraordinary. 10 years of cuts, we're incredibly efficient. Our service user involvement is exemplary compared to much of what I see in mainstream healthcare. Our outcomes, we don't just deliver outcomes, we actually track them. And very few parts of healthcare actually have outcomes. We are nimble, we're accessible, we're commissionable, we can do so much. And the things we've learned over the past 10 to 15 years of cuts, I think are transferable and importable into other parts of the sector. Leverage points. I'll stop after leverage points, I promise, Oliver. So great, so we're fantastic, we're brilliant, we've done amazing things. Two things I'd like to say very quickly. One, we work with complexity in a way that is kind of nimble and efficient and effective. We also work with risk in a way that I think is much more, what's the word? Much more, it's deft. We work with risk in a real deft way, and we don't get caught up in some of the bureaucratic approach you see elsewhere. So we also have leverage points, and we've got things like local authority JSNAs. I'll send this out afterwards, don't worry. Population health management improvement. Hi, Zoe. Combating drugs partnerships, ICB place-based structures, drug and importantly, the new drug and alcohol responsibilities of the ICP/B, commissioning and other consultations, and we can get involved through central government, OHID. We can get involved directly with central government on this, but more importantly, soft leverage point, active partnership works and relationships. And I don't have time to do the beautiful three horizons thing I was going to do at the end, which I will send out afterwards. But if I had time to do this and I hadn't messed up time, I would say that there are 3 horizons happening in a way right now. That we look at the drug and alcohol treatment commissioning system, and that is great. It over the next couple of years we will get this right, in my view. For drugs, possibly. Alcohol remains a huge unaddressed need within the sector. If we look to what's happening on Horizon 2 with what's definitely happening with ICBs and ICPs, some of the structures are coming into place and things are going to coalesce. The most important thing is what's happening on the 3rd horizon, which is keeping an eye on the weather, keeping an eye on what's happening within your local ICB at place level in particular, and looking for leverage points, and us as a sector really playing our part and getting involved in everything that's happening in mainstream healthcare, so that we can make the business case for communities under pressure and services under pressure. And I've totally messed up on time, and I'm sorry, Oliver. I'll stop there and hand over to Zoe.
No, that's quite all right. Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, that was as thoughtful and reflective and insightful as we could have hoped for. So yeah, thank you for that, and thank you for the note of optimism and actually taking time to reflect on the very many things that our field does do well and still manages to do well despite a decade of austerity and lots of other challenges. Just one being waiting lists, which definitely are not holding up in the same level in other bits of health and social care. So tons of stuff to circle back to. Thank you. And Zoe, straight over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna and Kevin. Thanks for the welcome, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here with you all today. Can I just check, can you see my slides? You can, marvellous, yes. Thank you. So, as Oliver mentioned at the beginning, I work with the Integrated Care Board for Bristol, North Somerset and South Gloucestershire. I joined that organisation but wasn't even the ICB then, it was a CCG back in January of this year. And I've been based there in the population health management team, which I'll explain a bit more about in a bit. But prior to joining, I've worked for many years in the drug and alcohol treatment sector, originally as a frontline worker and then in various leadership roles. So, having heard from Anna and Kevin, I'm now going to share a piece of work that we've been doing in Bristol, North Somerset and South Gloucestershire. And it's something we started a few months ago, so it's in the early stages. And at its heart, what we're trying to do is join things up so that together we can better serve people who experience drug and alcohol issues and reduce the inequalities that people experience. And before I go on to talk more about what we've been doing, I'd like to highlight two things. Firstly, this has very much been a team effort. My public health colleagues, I think some of whom are here today from our local authorities, have been a key part of this. And I also want to emphasise that this isn't the only thing that's happening locally to try and join things up. People are working on this in different ways all across our system. So this is a specific example that I'm sharing today. So let's move to the next slide. The approach we've been taking for the work is called population health management. And I'm going to start by explaining a bit more about what this is, talk about what we've been doing, and then finish with some reflections. So as you can hopefully see on the slide, population health management is about using joined up health and care records and working together to improve the health and well-being of our population. And in practical terms, what that means is we bring together people's records from primary care, hospital, mental health services, community services, etc. And we map that with information from the Office for National Statistics around things like deprivation. So we start to kind of get a more holistic view, and we start to think about some of the kind of wider determinants of health. And this approach of population health management is seen as a cornerstone or a kind of key enabler for integrated care systems. And what I think it can help us to start to do is to start to see whole people. So traditionally, when we think about data in health and care services, it's often for a specific condition or a specific service. And this approach is about trying to link things together and to start to, really recognise, as we well know in this sector, that people experience many things at the same time. It also helps us to start to see our whole population. So traditionally, data is for the people who walk through the door, for the people who are actually accessing certain services. This helps us to think about future needs, to think about our whole population, and to think about a more kind of preventative way of working. It also represents a shift from thinking as individual organisations to thinking as a whole system. And data is only ever a part of this. It will only ever give us part of the picture. It matters that we approach the data we have with curiosity, that we match it with what people tell us, with their stories, with people's narrative, and what the evidence says. And to my mind, population health management it's a kind of a way in. It helps us work out who to speak to. It's a way of starting a conversation. And of course, the important bit with all of this is actually what we're able to do with it and how that enables us to make a difference. So I'm going to share with you one example of how this approach can help us to start to think differently. And the slide that you can see has a kind of visualization of the conditions that have greatest impact for different age groups. And it looks at the top 5 conditions for each age group. And the principle is that the bigger the box, the bigger the impact. When I say impact, what we're talking about here is kind of prevalence, so how many people are experiencing it, the risk of mortality, and the intensity of service use. So if we look at a kind of 17 to 24-year-olds on this slide, you can see that anxiety and depression is the most impactful condition, followed by asthma, and then followed by drugs and alcohol. And if we move through to the kind of the next age group, we see drugs and alcohol is there again, and it's the second most impactful condition. And of course, there'll be loads of interconnections here. So people will experience more than one of these conditions at the same time. And some of the conditions that people experience earlier in life may well go on to kind of lead to the conditions they experience later on in life. And I think this visualization of our data that we hold, it's been a conversation starter locally. It's helped us to ask the questions. If we were going to design a system to meet people's needs based on this, what would it look like? And where are the opportunities over a life course to prevent things, to prevent kind of future ill health and need, and how can we keep people healthier? My other reason for saying this is that I think it highlights the impact, the significant impact that that drugs and alcohol have for our local system. And having this has enabled us, I think, to raise awareness at our kind of integrated care board of this. So having talked a bit about what PHM is, I'm now going to share with you a bit more about what we've been doing locally with this to try and focus on drugs and alcohol. So we started a project analysing our linked data, and with public health colleagues, we've come up with a set of questions that we want to ask our system-wide data set. And what we're looking at really is kind of according to our system-wide data set, what are the cohort of people who are experiencing drug or alcohol issues? What are their demographic characteristics and what are their health characteristics and how are they using services? And the purpose of doing this is to understand the population better and identify opportunities we can make a difference. And this analysis is going to be shared with our local combating drug partnerships, so one for each of our 3 local authority areas, our places. And the idea is that this will inform the needs assessments that are currently underway. This will be the first time that we've shared this kind of population health data focused on drugs and alcohol with partners, and we see it as a piece of a jigsaw. It's like the ICB contribution to the needs assessment, and hopefully we'll give a much fuller view of people's needs. The first stage of the analysis is nearly complete. I've had a kind of first glance at that today. And when we've got that analysis, our next step will be to do what I'd kind of call some collective sense making. So bringing together people, particularly people who use services, frontline staff, public health, people working across the system to kind of make sense of it together, to look at what we notice, to match it with people's stories and experiences. And the idea is that this will help us to understand things more deeply and identify the opportunities where we can have biggest impact. And we see this as a start of a much longer term piece of work. It's almost a bit of a kind of deeper understanding to plan out what we want to work on next. And this work has been very much more than data, I would say. We've been connecting with people, we've been building relationships, we've been trying to get the different people at the right meeting. So for example, we've been working to make sure that as part of the combating drug partnerships, we have the right ICB people as part of those. We've also been identifying gaps. And one thing that really struck me fairly early on after joining the Integrated Care Board was that whilst drugs and alcohol touches so many of the areas we're focused on, there wasn't a single function, person or team who had responsibility or oversight of drugs and alcohol at the Integrated Care Board. And I've heard from providers and public health about the challenges that has prevented. So we're now advocating that changes and kind of working through at the moment what that might look like and how we can take that forward. We've also been influencing the development of the ICS strategy. So just for a bit of context there, our ICS has kind of recently undertaken a needs assessment, looking at the needs of our population. We're now at a stage of writing a strategy, and a draft of that will be submitted in the next few weeks. And then after that, there'll be a piece of work on kind of identifying what the ICS level priorities are. And I think we're in a good position to argue the case for drugs and alcohol being there in whatever way as part of those priorities. Whether we manage to do that or not, we will see, but I'm optimistic that we've kind of got the building blocks in place to make that argument, and the analysis we're doing, I think, will support that as well. So I'm going to finish by sharing 2 reflections on the work. Firstly, PHM has been a useful, or population health management has been a useful approach to help kind of raise the profile of people who experience drug and alcohol issues. It's given us something tangible to work on together. And I think within the context of an integrated care board, population health management has kudos, has energy around it. So it's been a good approach for starting conversations and for making connections. It's been a way in. And you know, of kind of thinking about what Anna and Kevin talked about in terms of all the challenges that are happening at the moment, so the kind of born in the storm stuff, that is all there, it's absolutely there. And I can kind of feel that tension, you know, between the kind of here and now and the longer term stuff every day. I think in terms of drugs and alcohol, and it feels to me like just the right time to be doing that work now. Never has there been greater need for this kind of integration, with record levels of drug and alcohol related deaths and increasing harms. And we also have a convergence of several factors that can help us. We have Dame Carol Black's review, we have a national drug strategy with funding, and we've become an integrated care system all roughly at the same time. My final thought, though, is that locally, the kind of most important factor that has helped us take this work forward so far has been the will and energy amongst colleagues locally to do so. So I'd like to end with saying thank you to everyone who has helped with that.
Thank you, Zoe, and I can see Kevin clapping. So yeah, here from all of us, I think. The system is not a system without the people. It's it's an empty set of processes and pathways and so on. It's the people that bring it to life, that animate it and deliver services to the people that need them, isn't it? Thank you so much, Zoe, and thank you also again, Kevin and Anna. 3 really interesting and kind of varied, but very sort of sympathetic, if that's the right word, to one another, or complementary rather, presentations that I think together have given us a really kind of comprehensive whiz through this amazing kind of constellation of stuff out there that's happening. So thank you. That's brilliant. We're almost exactly halfway through, so we've got a really good amount of time for lots of questions. So I'm going to just keep firing them at you. And Zoe, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay, just because your thing is kind of freshest in people's minds. Someone's asked a question, and then I'll fire that to you, and then I'll rattle kind of between all 3 of you. So Zoe, Angela has said, which drug and alcohol data sets have fed into the strategic needs assessment? Really interesting to see the population health impact of drugs and alcohol relative to other acute and chronic health conditions.
So there might be 2 parts to this, okay. I think. So when we're talking about the integrated care system needs assessment, that's a kind of bringing together of all the existing local information. So that will include the work the local authorities, public health has done on that as part of it. And I may not be quite answering your question, but I'm going to use this as an opportunity to talk about it. When we're talking about the population health management, certainly locally, our system-wide data set doesn't currently include National Drug Treatment Monitoring System data at the moment, which I think is something that we should explore. And would be keen to kind of further conversations with people about that. I'm not sure of any integrated care system, because every integrated care system will be using population health management as approach. I haven't heard of anywhere yet that's included NDTMS data as part of that. And it feels to me like a really important link. Population health management, my sense is it's here to stay. It's only going to become more important and more kind of central in understanding needs. And my thinking is that if we were able to link that data, we'd be able to better see people who experience drug and alcohol issues and better meet their needs. And the other thing I just wanted to make clear, because I'm not sure if I said that clearly in the presentation, is that the system-wide data set is pseudonymized information. So I'll be in our local one for Bristol, North Somerset and South Gloucestershire, but you won't be able to tell who I am. So I just want to kind of provide some reassurance around the data with that. And I can see Kevin would like to say something, I think.
As ever, possibly. Just to augment that point, that while NDTMS itself will have its own, there's obviously governance around it and kind of a lawful basis for transferring the information, that information can also come out through local commissioning systems. In other words, in the back end of any case management system can be interrogated, and as long as the local basis is fine under GDPR, then local commissioners can draw that information out in a helpful way to integrate with any population level system. So it doesn't have to go through overhead.
And the thing I'd just add to that is, having sort of moved into the ICB and become a bit more familiar with kind of other data sets, I mean, what a rich asset NDTMS data is. It's such high quality as well, I think, in comparison with other data sets, that it's a real kind of asset that the sector has. That, I mean, my belief is we should use that and make the most of it. I've seen the level of work that goes on in terms of completing it. And my belief is we could do more with them.
Could I augment that point as well? Absolutely. And compared to the rest of healthcare, where outcomes are often, process outcomes are often lagging indicators, you know, that we have something incredibly rich in terms of, you know, genuine, you know, patient outcomes that can be evidenced and can be used and then can be merged with pseudonymously with other data sets to add a richness to it. So yes.
Great, thank you both. And to triangulate that point, the evidence I've got from working with civil servants is when they're able to draw an NDTMS as this big central kind of column of information, other areas of public health or, you know, domains of multiple disadvantage, it just doesn't exist for them. So it also supports their case making internally. Great, thank you both to that. Anna, I'm going to come to you for the next question, and Kevin, you might want to come in as well. So we're zooming right back up to kind of the top level strategic stuff here. The question is from David in the chat. Given that ICSs are born in a storm, I can't remember who used that phrase, but it's great. I might have to nick that. What were or what are the main drivers for initiating them at this point of time? Politics, question mark, health improvement, question mark, I would add other, question mark. In some ways, as Zoe's been saying, fantastic time. People are getting more familiar with systems thinking approaches, data, population management. This is great. We need to reduce inequalities. On the other hand, flipping out, there's so much other stuff going on, major challenges around the economic situation of the country, political flux, other bits of reform. So Anna, what are those kind of big picture drivers? I guess particularly around the politics, like how have we got to this point?
Sure, it's a really good question. And I suppose what it comes down to is, although in some ways ICS is very new, certainly in terms of their legal standing, you know, that's this year, that's less than 6 months in, they're not new at all, actually. That just kind of formalized what had been going on for many, many years. So at least going back to 2015, when STPs were asked to come together to produce those system plans, these local systems have been forming gradually over time at different paces in different parts of the country, particularly where they were sort of trying to go furthest in terms of their different ways of working. They were knocking up against the previous legal framework. It was getting in their way. It was complex workarounds, and there were lots of very legitimate concerns around, well, you know, what are these things? Who are they accountable to? None of this is very transparent. None of this is very clear. So there was a need to kind of reflect in formal terms what was actually already taking place within local systems. So very much this set of changes that went through Parliament this year in terms of the legal context for ICSs was trying to put a formal framework around what was already taking place rather than invent something new from the centre. So that's the context for them sort of coming about now. And I mean, why July? Because of the timetable it took to get to that point. I suppose the question you could then ask is, well, should it have been put on pause when that process initiated? We hadn't had COVID. We didn't know we were going to have the level of sort of economic challenges that we have now. But I mean, I would certainly think, no, you don't stop at that point. Actually, are you going to be better placed to address some of the challenges we have around, demand for services at the moment, around services not being able to meet people's needs, around workforce shortages? Are you better placed to tackle those with every organisation looking down at their own bit of the problem? Or are you better placed to tackle those issues with them all looking up and outwards to what they can do together? And I think it's certainly the latter. So I think the key thing around it is what you then expect of ICSs in terms of what can they realistically do and achieve in that environment, and what is considered as whether ICSs have succeeded or failed. If you judge ICSs at the moment on whether they're balancing the books financially, it's perhaps not a fair assessment, because perhaps the financial ask they're being given isn't realistic in the first place. So it's about being aware of that context and understanding that they've come into it. But I don't think that would be a reason to not go forward with this set of changes.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Thank you. Kevin, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just to kind of re-emphasize what I said at the start, which is that they also could be viewed as an insurrection or a rebellion against what was planned for the 2012 reforms, the idea of contestability of markets, of, you know, of any willing provider being able to compete with any other. That never really happened, not properly and not in the way that Lansley imagined, if you like. And I think the evolution and the genesis of ICSs was, and again, it's really interesting. If you look at it, it was meant to be, you know, some of the literature was about health and social care reforming, if you like. Really, it's been healthcare reforming. Social care has been out of this picture, so you could view it, and I've often said this, as an anarcho-syndicalist tract where communities are rising up and creating brand new healthcare structures, or a cabal of NHS providers getting together to organise things together. It is very much the NHS Integrated Care Board, right? It's very much, you know, so it's interesting. You know, we could view it optimistically as great opportunities for everyone to do things brilliantly, or more cynically as a response to previous government attempts to corral things. It's probably a bit of both, actually.
Yeah, thank you. It makes sense, Kevin. There's a question here from Mike in the chat, which follows on very nicely from that. Actually, it was a good segue there. Has any NHS reform ever been based on a premise that there will be an equal partnership with the voluntary and community sector? And if not, why should we think that this one will be any different? So obviously a really key issue here with drug and alcohol treatment and recovery being, you know, on a huge scale delivered by charities at a very, very large scale of complexity. Kevin?
Yeah, as you can imagine this, I mean, I think I've got three quick things to say about this. One, and Mike, who I know very well, is absolutely right to say that one could be very suspicious about this and the equality of the VCS sector in particular. I spoke to a very senior person in the NHS at the start of all of this who genuinely couldn't understand our sector. Couldn't understand it. What do you mean it's local authorities commissioning VCS sector to deliver healthcare? Like, charities don't deliver healthcare, really, do they? Maybe, you know, Marie Curie, maybe, you know, and it's a huge mental block to what our sector looks like and feels like. And I think that's probably changing over time. I mean, I think there's hope in there. You know, the VCSE is expressly, you know, represented and mentioned throughout. There's a danger in some areas we become social prescribing in little itty bitty parts, you know, but I think it is to play for. I think there is, you know, and in some of the more mature systems it is to play for. And I point to things like anchor institution responsibilities for foundation trusts, you know, and provider collaboratives where they're getting more rooted in place, more rooted where they are, and a chance for the VCS to, you know, and the VCS is about 14,000 different conceptions of what the voluntary sector is, but a chance to play, that's the wrong word, a chance to participate and collaborate in a different way. But absolutely, this did not start from a point where the third sector were imagined as equal partners. Let's see how we can influence that perception would be my call to arms.
Thank you. And Zoe, you've obviously come over from working from a charity providing health and social care into the ICS or the ICB kind of fairly recently, and you've got this total perspective shift. What have your reflections been on how the voluntary sector is perceived from your new vantage point?
So I think some of the things I would point to, and it kind of builds on what Kevin said, really. I think the NHS and talking about the ICB really find the voluntary sector complex, and it's almost just like, oh, there's so many organisations, and how do we know where to start? And you know, and it is a really diverse sector, isn't it? From, you know, in Bristol we have our local area, we have such a rich sector ranging from organisations which employ 3 people through to national organisations who deliver homelessness services here. And I think there's something about that kind of the complexity of it. So there's something about, I think, how the sector, the voluntary sector, and I know there's work underway locally to do this, kind of organises in a kind of collaborative to be able to engage. And I think there's the questions there around, you know, how does one organisation represent, you know, the kind of the wider sector, but there's something about how the sector organises itself to be able to engage with the ICS and become a kind of meaningful and powerful voice. Another thing I've noticed is that we have our like a locality partnerships. So we have 6 of those locally. And what I notice is that the voluntary sector voice seems to be strongest in that. So at that smaller geographical area. And what I also notice is I think the voluntary sector voice is strongest amongst organisations who, it isn't necessarily drug or alcohol treatment services, it's organisations doing kind of community development stuff where they're working in a kind of a much broader way. So there's something there about how how drug and alcohol treatment services are represented. And then a final reflection around language, actually. So I'm happy to share, as I shared with colleagues at the ICB, I think when I joined the ICB, I first of all felt I probably understood about 20% of what was being talked about at meetings. And I thought, you know, I had just come back from maternity leave, actually. So I did sort of think, maybe this is me, maybe I just don't, you know, maybe I've forgotten everything, which I'm sure was probably part of it. But my broader reflection on that was that actually we use quite different language. So in the NHS, we talk about wider determinants of health. In drug and alcohol treatment services, we just talk about housing and jobs. There's, you know, and that's just one example, but I think the language is part of that, and it's important, and we need to acknowledge that, and feel safe to be able to say, I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Thank you, Zoe. Yeah, that all kind of rang really true from my my perspective as well. And I'd certainly say from leading Collective Voice for the past 4.5 years, self-organisation is an almost sacred principle. That's what I've learned. That's what I've concluded. If you accept the premise that we're all working in a complex, or multiple complex environments, we have to resolve and reduce that complexity by self-organizing into more easily digestible collectives, developing shared positions, dealing with some of the different perspectives so that we can then simplify ourselves to engage with other bits of the system and build that sense of you know, power in numbers, build alliances of the willing. I think it's tremendously important. Kevin.
Yeah, just want to come in as well. Say there's also something, like I said in my presentation, unique about some of the providers who are sitting around this table, because we are healthcare providers, CQC regulated. We deliver free at the point of delivery NHS services on behalf of public health, and that's a unique, almost unique, definitely unique. That 60% of the sector of that particular healthcare unit of analysis is delivered by the third sector, and that makes us anomalous in everywhere we go. We're slightly odd. We're anomalous at VCSE fora because we're NHS providers. We're anomalous in the NHS because we're third sector. And there's something about getting that voice out and heard and kind of just greening both sides, if you like, which I think we do need to do. And there's a couple of fiddly questions in the Q&A about provider selection regime and stuff, which if we don't have time to take, I'll happily send out as an addendum to this group. Yeah.
Okay, great. No, thank you, Kevin. Anna, I'm going to come to you, just sticking with this VCSE theme, because I think I can tell it's really uppermost in a lot of people's minds, given the who's here today. So kind of firstly, like just reflections from your sort of macro perspective at the King's Fund on involvement of charities, bearing in mind just how different some of them are. And then there's a specific question from Rebecca in the chat who's saying, I work within a charity and wondered who we would need to contact within our area to access information. Basically Rebecca's saying we want to get involved in the ICS, like where do we go? So that sense of like a front door, if there is an obvious one. Yeah, Anna, if you could take that one, please.
Yeah, sure, thanks. And it's such an interesting discussion. And I mean, from a national point of view, we've worked quite closely actually with national voices around thinking through some of these issues and convening discussions around them and trying to get that, like you said, the sort of collective voice of the VCS with all its variation and diversity sort of front and centre of some of the decisions that were being made about ICSs over recent years. I would just add to the points that previously made, there are some, I wouldn't at all pretend that the experience of most people of their integrated care system at the moment is that they feel as a VCS provider they are an equal partnership. That's a sort of aspiration rather than a reality. There are some good examples though of how systems are working to try and kind of shift that power dynamic. So whether it's a place for a representative of the VCS on the integrated care board, and as we've described, where the VCS has organised into an alliance, or some kind of representative form locally, then that has provided a sort of route for that. There are some systems that have appointed a sort of specific VCS engagement lead within the ICS. I'm sure there's varying success of that. And also really interestingly, in some systems, they're kind of operating on the basis of the right person to lead the right strand of work. So, if you've got a programme of work around working with your homeless population, doesn't have to be a senior leader from the NHS that is the lead for that strand of work. It could be a partner from the VCS, it could be a partner from local government. It's whoever's best placed to lead that work. So I think those are some sort of principles that point in a slightly different direction to the idea that we're the NHS, we're the big thing, and everybody else can do what we tell them to do, ask them to do. In terms of the who do you go to, how do you engage, it's a question we get asked all the time, and it's so frustrating because I don't have a good answer. I especially don't have a good single answer on a national basis. It's so variable. So it totally depends where you sit locally. One thing I would say is these are kind of new structures, but actually in many cases, a lot of the people behind the jobs haven't changed. So it might be that whatever lead you were working with in the CCG is actually still there in the ICB, or likewise in local government. And these aren't completely sort of separate things. The ICS is a collection of its constituent parts. So it may be, via connections that are working elsewhere in the system that they can create those connections, but there isn't an obvious place to go in terms of who's in what post. And like Zoe says, it's often that there isn't a specific post. It might be worth passing to Zoe to say, how would it work in your system if someone wanted to get in touch, because it's often easier, I think, to explain that locally than it is from a national perspective, because there isn't a sort of obvious route in. And that relates to a kind of wider issue at the moment, I think, just around sort of as they've got up and running, how transparent are the arrangements in ICSs if you aren't close to them, and there's a lot that could be improved from that for sure.
Thank you. And yeah, I just add in, I think there's quite a few questions about like, how do I get involved, where do I go? And just as a simple example, and maybe we could use it as a case study, Zoe, for your area, Rachel and Leela have both said, we've recently been appointed as Health and Justice Partnership Coordinators by HMPPS. So coming from a kind of probation angle, we want to connect and make things happen. Where would they go to access that ICS? Plus wider thoughts, Zoe.
Okay, so I guess the first bit is a bit of context for the ICB right now, which is that we are reorganising ourselves. So having become an ICB on the 1st of July, we've now moved to a position of kind of having a new structure. And people are transitioning in the organisation to different functions and to different roles. So that's the context right now, which builds on the kind of narrative about the time of flux and the time of change. So I think about acknowledging that. There is, for example, locally, we now have in fact, within the directorate I'm going to be in, there is a kind of specific focus of one directorate and responsibility around the voluntary sector. So that may be a way in as well. Another angle, I think, is inequalities. So there will, I think, be a lead for inequalities. For us locally, it's our Chief Medical Officer who has that overall kind of accountability around inequalities. So there's different ways in. It's sort of, and I think, to be honest, this has been a challenge for us locally, actually. When we've been trying to join things up, and people say, who do we go into the ICB? Who do we go to at the ICB for this? And I sort of say, well, it depends for what, really. And I think so it is a challenge, and it also links for me back to the work, that sort of gap we've identified, that for drugs and alcohol, we don't at the moment have a single point of contact that could help navigate people around. So that is something we're working on locally to change. And I suppose I would probably, and this isn't a very structural answer, but I would probably think about this also in terms of, like Anna said, there may already be existing relationships there at CCG you worked with before. So I would be thinking about, who do I know? What relationships are there that, even if they're not in the right team, who can help you navigate to get to the right place initially? I'm going to pause and hand over to others to share thoughts. I can see Kevin's got his hand up.
Perpetual hand up. I mean, there's so many ways through which to do this, I think. I mean, going back to the commissioning side of things, that's interesting, right? So public health are a bridge. They should be involved. They are involved, right? That the local authorities are involved, certainly at that place level. Should be a bridge back into CCG and old money and ICB commissioning. And I think as part of some of the work I've been doing with organisations, it really has been working with public health commissioners to understand their place in the system, and then how they relate to health, if you like, to mainstream health, and then a bridge that way, if you like. And also there's something about we're kind of observing the climate and the weather at the same time. Things are changing, big things are changing and little things are changing. So just be nimble and just see what's happening locally. And it's not, I think as a sector we're pretty nimble anyway, but just notice who's doing what about what. There's nothing wrong with this not being about the voluntary sector either, that this being about deprivation, or being about mental health, or being about and us then getting involved thematically. That's good, right? As long as we're nimble enough to get involved in those themes. Yeah. And I think there's something about, over the next couple of years, the organizations that are nimble, that are really responsive to local community need, and that really understand that this is a collaboration and it's not about a contract anymore. They're the ones who will do well locally, I think, and be proper local community organizations, if you like, which there's no barrier to a national organization doing that. They absolutely can do that. It's just, I think it's a bit more nuanced than perhaps the work that we as a sector have done already.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you, Kevin. I mean, one of the principles of the sort of systems thinking is, if everything is connected, then you can start anywhere, because eventually you'll get to everywhere. So it sort of sounds a bit Gnostic, but if you know someone in your local area who you think might know, be curious, go and have a chat, have a dig around on the websites, take your local ICS as a case study where you actually live or work, and just dive in. Like, I remember Kevin and I discussed this question, and he kind of set me the task, use where you live, just work out, if you walk into your GP surgery, how is that connected to other bits of the system, etc., etc. And you can almost use that as a test, can't you? Right, I can see this has excited lots of interest in our panelists here. So I'm not sure who put their hand up first. So let's go to Anna and then to Zoe.
Yeah, thank you. It was only to add, this just took me back to one of my colleagues at the fund, when sort of talking about this, whether it's in relation to social care providers' involvement with the ICS or BCS, or whatever partner that isn't sort of one of the big NHS bodies part of this, is that it's helpful to also think about, in what way do you want to engage around particular issues, because being realistic as well, you've got limited bandwidth as someone leading a VCS organisation, working in a VCS organisation. You just won't be able to engage on everything. So where is it important to engage, and also what different ways are there? So he talks about there might be areas where you want to lead, where you want to collaborate, where you want to influence, or where you want to advocate. So if it's an area you want to lead, is it actually an area where it's appropriate for you as the partner to be taking the lead on that, and how would you push for that? Or if it's an area actually where it makes sense for you to collaborate with the ICS but not to lead. Separately, it might be where you want to influence, you want to shape the agenda but not actually do. Or you might want to just advocate. So you're either advocating for others with the ICS, or actually vice versa. You might be advocating for the ICS with others in your sector, with those that you work with. So just having in your mind not only what you want to engage on, but how you want to engage at different points of time can just help, because otherwise it can just feel like too much.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Zoe.
Thank you. So I want to go back slightly to, we talked about the kind of we call them locality partnerships, so localities where we have 6 across our kind of ICS, and just kind of build on that kind of where, Oliver, there's no wrong place to start, is there? We've got to start somewhere. And I just want to add a couple of observations about locality partnerships that might be useful to know. So I observe the locality partnerships doing some really innovative stuff in local areas. So they're often doing what I think is really cool, like community connectors projects, really are involving people, trying different things out. So there's something there about that. Seems to be a space where people are able to test stuff, to really kind of learn about what happens when they do. And I think the other part of that, just to share, is that certainly in our area, whilst there's been this ICS level needs assessment, the locality partnerships have also been working to identify their priorities recently. And interestingly, drugs and alcohol has shown up there. So part of our work locally has been kind of connecting people to, so in South Bristol, for example, they've got a much higher level of people being admitted to hospital with alcohol-related admissions, and they want to do some work on it. We've helped link them into providers, to public health. And it's just that, I just want to make the connection that there may be locality partnerships who are thinking about this issue and would really appreciate people's involvement and connection with.
Okay, thank you, Zoe. Kevin, just going to come to you briefly because we've got a ton of other interesting topics to chuck in as well. Go for it.
Yeah, I was going to come in with alcohol. Yeah, absolutely. I think if anything's going to resonate with mainstream healthcare commissioners, it's going to be alcohol, because it is hugely expensive to them and causes myriad problems, and people you'll get a willing audience, but I'll stop because there's far more questions.
No, thank you. That's a really useful one. So we've got a couple of questions here, which I think probably for Kevin and Zoe. So Anonymous has said, how is it anticipated that the CDP, so that's the Combating Drugs Partnerships, will influence and be influenced by the ICB? And then Richard has asked, with the welcome tsunami of funding into the system, limited capacity to mobilise the array of funding, how are local authority commissioners and providers able to engage with their local ICSs? So basically, linking these two worlds. Kevin, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, sure. I'll have a go. I mean, the first thing to say is I don't think there is a tsunami of funding coming in. I think by the time the cost of living increases and by the time we give people the pay rises that they're due, by the time the workforce levels off, I don't think that the DCP monies is a tsunami of funding. In fact, by my calculations, we'd have used it all up in about 18 months. So I don't think that is the case. And I think to the wider question, that then puts the ball back in our court to create a business case and to go to mainstream health, to look at the rest of it, and so that's one thing to observe. The partnerships should be partnerships. The people around the table on the partnership is very similar to the people around the table on in ICBs, right? Particularly at place level. So there should be a connection. What I've observed, in some places there is, and in some places there isn't, and both of them are evolving at the same time. So I think there's lots more to see in this space as those two, as the drugs partnership and the healthcare commission partnership align, if you like. That's what I've seen so far. Zoe, in your area?
So I'm going to share a couple of thoughts on that kind of more broadly, really. I suppose in my head, and this is probably a bit simplistic, but I almost am seeing combating drug partnerships and the locality partnership boards as two sides of the same coin. And I think that is a key part for thinking about the kind of representation. So ICB people need to be part of combating drug partnerships, and then the other way around as well. So there needs to be kind of public health provider representation as part of the locality partnership. So to me, that's a really key area. But then there's also, like you talked about at the beginning, Anna, there's a kind of broader, there's the Integrated Care Partnership Board, where we have directors of public health represented as well. So it's kind of, there's all these links across the system. And locally, we talk about 1, 3 and 6. So we have 1 ICS, then we've got the 3 local authorities, and then we have the 6 locality partnerships as well. And I think it's the connection across all 3 levels. And then there was something I should have mentioned earlier to do with when we were talking about this. We do have a kind of population health team as well, which does bring together ICB people and public health, where from Bristol City Council, in this case, we've had a public health consultant who's seconded in to work across the whole ICS, and that has helped with linkages, with working together.
Yeah, and can just add that locally, looking across the 3 places where I live, it's evolving, and I think I would say 2 of the 3 have figured out that they're the same partnership roughly, so let's do things together, and 1 of the 3, the penny is yet to drop, I think. But that's okay, isn't it? Because over time, perhaps we can help the penny to drop, and nobody wants to go to the same meeting twice, right?
Absolutely. Thank you. From my perspective, I'd say the drug strategy from harm to hope has a reference to ICSs and CDPs sort of taking due notice of them or something like that. I mean, there's nothing hugely detailed, but if you are working with and for and through a CDP, that can give you the political cover you might need to go and start a conversation with the people in the ICS in your local areas. And then, as Zoe said, the CDPs, just like the ICSs, that have a lot of regional variability or variation in them. They're forming in different ways. Most of them are sort of sticking to local authority footprints, but they're not all. Some are bigger, some are going to PCC footprints and sort of taking other approaches and sort of embodying the health crime duality. A lot of them have PC, or some of them have PCCs as chairs, but a lot of them are going to have the Director of Public Health as the chair, and then that is a route straight into the ICS, one would hope. So I think there is stuff there, but it's not sort of immediately mapped out. Yeah. Anna, a question for you. So Abigail has asked a question about pooling. I think you mentioned about pooling of resources, something like that. So she, I guess Abigail sort of raised the possibility, could that see money moved away from substance misuse services to other health priorities? And then I guess the slightly broader question from me would be just how will that pooling of resource work, and how does it impact on kind of lines of accountability and governance and indeed kind of strategic priority setting?
Sure. So when I was talking about pooling, what I was specifically sort of describing, I suppose, is where at the moment you have budgets that sit quite separately. Having the ICS there that, you know, you can identify these are our collective priorities, and we recognise that, you know, you are spending this little pocket of money on this thing that relates to drug and alcohol services, and over here we're spending this little bit of money that also relates to that, and over here something different. That actually by having all those partners together, looking at that bigger picture, actually you can think, okay, actually in totality the pot we have for this issue, for this priority is this, and how could we use it better if we joined that up? So that's what I was describing there. In terms of how pooling is actually taking place, I think some people were quite disappointed actually when the legislation went through that there wasn't kind of more ambition and push, particularly in terms of how local authorities and the NHS could pool budgets. It still remains quite separate, and it's actually the same mechanisms that have existed for a long time, whether it be Section 75 agreements or Better Care Fund, that exist, and some systems are making good use of those to align budgets, and some systems making less use of them. There was some suggestion earlier in the year in an integration white paper from the government there would be new guidance around those mechanisms and how they could be used to sort of go further on budget pooling, but we haven't yet seen anything come off the back of that. In terms of actually shifting resources between priority areas, I think so that's something a little bit different. I think, you know, as systems like Zoe is describing are going about the process of setting their strategies, of understanding the data locally, of deriving those priorities and thinking about how they then best organise things in support of that, then you may see some sort of shifts in terms of where the priorities are. But again, as Zoe described, this is building up from existing, this isn't something completely new. So those ICS-wide strategies are intended to build up from strategic needs assessments, from health and wellbeing board strategies. So it shouldn't be that this suddenly brings some kind of huge shift. I can see Zoe nodding. I don't know if there's anything you want to add on that.
I think just to kind of agree with your point really about this none of this is kind of starting from scratch, is it? It feels like there's so many layers to this, and a lot of this is trying to bring it together, is what it feels like to me, and to work out how to work on it together.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you both. That makes sense. Probably just one or two final questions, and then we'll unfortunately have to sum up and bring things to a close.
Just come in a second. I did answer 2 questions preemptively in the Q&A session, probably went, and I then, sorry, in the chat, and I said we'd pick them up in the Q&A session.
Okay.
So they might have disappeared, and it was to do with the provider selection regime.
Do you want to do that now, Kevin?
Do it
please.
Really quickly. And there's a question that was asked, and it's one of the, I guess, the touch points where this does become relevant and become live. That the provider selection regime, which is the new way in which, theoretically, if it eventually comes in, services could and should be commissioned, that explicitly public health commissioned treatment services, if they are healthcare, will come into the provider selection regime. So it is something to look out for and to look forward to, if you like. It just means that the core services in drug and alcohol treatment are treated like other healthcare services for the purposes of commissioning. So we need to look out for that. Hasn't happened yet, and it's somewhat in the long grass. And that could mean that there is a very light touch commissioning regime allowed for public health, but not mandated. Okay.
Thank you, Kevin. We've got a question in the chat from Annie. Annie said, is there any hope of better joined up support for people who are not engaging or engaged with substance misuse services? And she talks about them experiencing stigmatizing, I'd broaden that out very slightly and, use the phrase of social justice or reducing inequalities. Can this reorganization of health and possibly care services deliver a more equal society, I guess?
That's the marmot question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Can I kind of I'll just come in and
go for it.
Just, absolutely, if there is any call to action from the ICS, if there's anything we can do collaboratively that would really make the most difference, it is to help with those underpinning factors, the deprivation, the adverse childhood experiences, the traumatized populations, that we can turn the billions of pounds of a local health economy towards alleviating some of the underpinning issues, even simple things like treating the whole healthcare economy like we are an anchor institution, and we're going to spend our money wisely in areas where it should be spent. And I mean that practically, like by putting our offices and our people and recruiting from local communities, but also to start to turn our attention to the underpinning and to the foundational issues that affect our communities. Please make it be so. And that's, if there's one thing we can all do together, is really focus on that, is my call to arms.
Thank you. Anna and Zoe, just on that point.
Yeah, it's such a good point. I certainly hope so. And there's some really, there's some promising things. If you look at, I mentioned the 4 objectives for ICS that NHS England set out. You might expect them to be very NHS-y, but actually one of them is supporting broader social and economic development. One of them is about improving outcomes in population health and healthcare with a specific focus on inequality. So they're the right things, and people are definitely saying the right things. It's just whether you can really, whether we see that sort of translate into what they actually focus on. I see really encouraging things all the time. So, for example, I spoke just a couple of days ago to colleagues in North East London, ICS, who have been doing lots of joint work across their system, understanding who is affected by cost of living pressures and how, and then targeting specific support and advice at those particular groups, thinking about their staff actually across health and care and how they are affected by cost of living pressures. So, thinking in a different way, not just focusing on what's turning up at the front door of A&E, but that's the big challenge, isn't it?
Zoe.
Yes, I share the hope. Absolutely, we must. And I think I also see signs of hope for it, like you mentioned, Anna, as well. And we just need a really broad lens. We need to see much further. And I think for that's structure's a part of it, but there's a mindset shift and there's a kind of cultural transformation that is needed for this too.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Zoe. Folks, I did promise you just a tiny fragment of time each at the end if you had any final thoughts or observations, words of wisdom, calls to arms, challenges. So we're a bit low on time, but 20 to 30 seconds each if you want it. Who's going to go? Kevin.
I'll go. Oh,
Well, Zoe.
Okay. So all of this, I think, can feel really confusing. I think we just need to accept that it is that way. Even at the Integrated Care Board, we're working this stuff out too. We need to know that it's that way, that it is being worked through, and not let that stop us from doing stuff we can. Because I think there's a lot of opportunities, we can do stuff, and it's important to take those forward.
Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, I would return to what I said earlier. In this sector, what we've learned over the past 15 years about how to deliver services, how to do it empathetically, how to do it properly with communities and within communities, and the efficiency and effectiveness stuff. We've got so much to give, and let's use that wisdom, that knowledge, and transfer it into local areas and fly the flag for communities under pressure.
Thank you. Anna.
Yeah, thanks. Just very brief thoughts, but I really support the approach that Zoe was describing, using population health management tools, understanding the data locally, and actually alongside that, understanding views, experiences of citizens, of communities, that can just be such a powerful driver and actually sort of create the common cause that will sort of bind the ICS together. And then just the final thing, and I hope it's come across really strongly, but it's so true that if you've seen one ICS, you've seen one ICS. They're so different. So the extent to which you can get to know yours locally will stand you in good stead, because they don't all look the same.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anna. There was so much in there and we're out of time. I'm not even going to attempt to do any summing up. What I want to do, I'm just going to share two small comments from the chat, because two people have just shared very practical things about how they have managed to engage locally. So Laura has said, we've involved ourselves via participation in local safeguarding adult board. And Mark has pointed out a potential in is via co-occurring conditions, dual diagnosis. The Community Mental Health Framework, 3 different documents, explicitly states that NHS commissioners should be working with drug and alcohol commissioners, providers, and VCSE. So there you go. That's just 2 as kind of examples of what else is out there. I think this agenda is so interesting. It is kind of overwhelming at times, but it's also really encouraging, and just the potential for it delivering social justice and multiple front doors to people that we've failed to help as a society. This is really big picture stuff that goes to the social contract of what it means to be a citizen, what public services are and should be, what place is. The re-emergence of place in policy has been fascinating over the sort of past 5 to 10 years. Everyone's getting on board with the systems thinking stuff, which really does help and enable some of this stuff. So thank you massively to Zoe, Anna and Kevin. Really, really interesting and informative session today with 3 brilliant speakers. Collective Voice will continue to fly the flag and make our contribution on this through events like this and blogs and sharing of information and good practice. So we hope you'll continue to kind of join us as we do that kind of work. Thank you for being here. Look out for the recording and the slides on our social media, and take care of yourselves. Thank you.